We look at the reasons for sow mortality. Certainly in that time period, one of the things that we noticed was a certain increase in pelvic organ prolapse mortality. But, if you really look at, what are kind of the root causes, there's lots of reasons, but really you can kind of fit them in three buckets, right? You've got about a third is caused by pelvic organ prolapse related mortality, so vaginal, uterine, rectal, or some combination of those above. You got about a third of them are due to lameness. That's been one that we've probably been struggling, certainly with probably for the longest time period. And then the other third is kind of the catch-all, right? Because we know people on farm, it's pretty easy to classify prolapses and pretty easy to classify lameness. Sudden death is kind of the catch-all.
Welcome to the Swine Health Blackbelt Podcast, the latest swine health research digested for you. My name is Dr. 𝗬𝗽𝗀𝗁. I'm the host of the podcast, and joining me on this week's episode is Dr. Chris Rademacher, a clinical professor and swine extension veterinarian at Iowa State University College of Veterinary Medicine and the associate director of the Iowa Pork Industry Center at Iowa State University. Dr. Rademacher, thank you so much for coming on the show. If you would, why don't you start by giving the audience a little bit of an introduction?
Yeah, appreciate it. Glad to be on. Spend some time with you here today, Clayton. Yeah, a little on my background. Born and raised in southern Minnesota. I went to the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine in 1994. And as I was getting into vet school, a neighbor of mine, Dr. Brad Frecking, was getting out. He started a company called New Fashion Pork. So when I graduated in 1998, he offered me the opportunity to work there. So really got to spend the first 11 years of my professional practice career helping him build that company from 1,000 sows to about 60,000 sows when I left in 2009. I had the opportunity then actually to backfill a position with Murphy Brown, which was the live production animal arm of Smithfield Foods at that time in what was called the Western operations, which were all the operations that were west of the Appalachian Mountains. So I got to spend the next 5.5 years as the director of production improvement when Dr. Main left Murphy Brown to take over as the VDL operations director. So spent that time overseeing production from 330,000 sows and providing technical expertise for the 13 veterinarians that worked alongside me there. And then in December of 2014, I had the opportunity to join the faculty in the swine group there at Iowa State University and been there ever since.
Excellent. Chris, you got a long and distinguished career, and I know you didn't ever have any sow mortality problems while you were in practice, right? Every farm you would have worked with was way below target, never had a sow die, but the industry finds itself in a challenging situation as it relates to sow mortality, and I know this is an area that you personally have kind of taken on, and I perceive that's got to do with your swine extension role, right? You're trying to help producers with what they think are problems, and there's a lot of producers that think sow mortality is a problem. So with that set up, talk to us a little bit about what you've worked on through the years and kind of where your work has progressed.
Yeah, I think really what we all saw in the industry was kind of in about 2013, 2014, the whole industry kind of took an inflection point, right? We were kind of sitting in that 8 to 9%. If you look at most of the databases, that's what the average was. And then all of a sudden we started increasing that by about 1%, 1 percentage points a year on mortality. Now we're sitting somewhere where the average is sitting somewhere at about 15 to 17%. So, we've seen this really massive explosion in sow mortality for various number of reasons. And yeah, even during my practice career, you would always know you'd have certain farms that you would have trouble with. And we had the opportunity to go in, and it always seemed like we had opportunity where we could influence that potentially, right? Just with some certain management practices. So I wanted to take the opportunity, certainly as various research projects, we tend to be very applied at Iowa State, and say, can we look at doing some things where we're just looking to spend some time identifying sows earlier at risk? It seems like particularly with, as we get busy and we know how tight labor constraints are, in the Midwest and what an issue labor really is, We know our breeding and gestation staff are extremely tasked. They have lots of things to do. And we know that, treating sows is one of those things, well, we'll get to it, when we can. And then if we get short on labor, that's usually one of the first things that, gets dropped, right? So it just felt like we had the opportunity here to spend some more time looking at ways that we could work with our management staff and see if we could make a dent in that. If we look at the reasons for sow mortality, certainly in that time period, one of the things that we noticed was a certain increase in pelvic organ prolapse mortality. But, if you really look at, what are kind of the root causes, there's lots of reasons, but really you can kind of fit them in three buckets, right? You've got about a third is caused by pelvic organ prolapse related mortality, so vaginal, uterine, rectal, or some combination of those above. You got about a third of them are due to lameness. That's been one that we've probably been struggling, certainly with probably for the longest time period. And then the other third is kind of the catch-all, right? Because we know people on farm, it's pretty easy to classify prolapses and pretty easy to classify lameness. Sudden death is kind of the catch-all for everything else, right? So, but when we look at it, that's really kind of what the three majority areas that we try to classify mortality really in.
Chris, those sows are almost always given a reason code, and you kind of mentioned some of the common ones that are there, but you and I have talked previously, and I know this is not a surprise to a lot of people, but the reason codes are so variable. You got any tips out there? Have you seen anybody who's doing that really well, or anybody who's kind of made that what is inherently subjective into more objective? To your point, the prolapses are pretty easy to identify, but is there a template out there you'd recommend that's best practice for the reason code part of it?
Yeah, that is the toughest one by far. The best systems I've seen probably got it narrowed down, whittled down to about 7 or 8. But like I say, when you really roll them all up, they pretty much can fit into about 3 of those categories. And we really tend to think, because we don't tend to do a lot of sow necropsies, you really can about fit them into those 3 buckets. It's pretty easy to see the lameness. It's pretty easy to see the pelvic organ prolapses, and then sudden death kind of gets to be the catch-all for really everything else.
Yeah. You mentioned your applied research, Chris. Have you guys been able to demonstrate an ability to impact the sow mortality?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were on a 5-year National Pork Board FFAR grant alongside Kansas State and Purdue. So we looked at different ways to impact mortality, really we looked at 4 phases, right? We looked at sow mortality, pre-wean mortality, nursery, and finishing mortality. So one of the more applied projects that we looked at, we worked with one system, was how could we look at reducing sow mortality? And that one came back to me. It was a summer project when I spent time with Smithfield. We had an intern that just came in with a farm. Farm would go in and feed. It was a once a day feeding stall type, 2,500 head farm. She would come in behind after they fed, and then she would just kind of, everything that wasn't eating, she would make some notes and treat it according to the treatment protocol. And it was interesting. She was there like 6 weeks, and mortality dropped from 6 to 7 deaths a week to 1 to 2 a week. And then she went back to school, and it went right back to normal, right? So, I just thought that was interesting. It's one of those ones you kind of tuck in your rear pocket, and you say, we really probably need to take a closer look at that. So that was really the goal of one of the applied research projects was, okay, let's see if we can do that again on a farm, but this time let's get the farm staff engaged in it, and let's see if we can train them and then walk away and see if they can maintain it. So not that when we walk out, it goes back, but hopefully it declines. So we had the opportunity on a 4,000 head sow farm, PRRS mycoplasma positive. We spent 2 weeks with the farm staff, and they got it after about 3 or 4 days in, right? Because they were tired of hauling out dead sows. They're like, well, wait a minute. If we go in and just identify the sows at the time of feeding, they aren't off feed. And all they did really was just hang a card, right? And then they still wanted to heat check and breed and all that. And we're like, that's fine. Just come back at the end of the day when you're done with your other chores. And then you can do a much more deep and thorough investigation and work through. And we didn't do anything. The treatment protocol looked good. We're like, just follow your treatment protocol and treat the ones that need treating, right? Give them the appropriate attention. And we did that for 2 weeks and felt really good after we walked away. And sure enough, we looked at, the mortality at the 26 weeks before we started the project. And the farm was, one that was, they were probably one of the higher ones in the system. They were about 17% mortality. And then we followed it for the next 6 months after we did the training, and they dropped to 12.5% mortality. So, it was amazing, fantastic. And really all that we were asking them to do was just identify the sows that weren't eating. Now, obviously that fit that one, right? It was once a day, and they dropped feed right when they got there in the morning, and we're just asking them to hang the cards, right? But I think what happens is, in a lot of these situations where they're in that type of situation, they can just get so busy with what they're doing, they're not paying attention, right? But we have the ability, when those sows at risk, the first thing that happens with those, if they're not feeling right, they're going to go off feed, right? That's the first clue. And we got to really zone in and pay attention to that. So if you have that type of operation, that is the key, right? And we're actually in the process of duplicating this in several other farms. That system took that and applied it to all their farms, and saw, in addition to some other things they're working on, they saw a 3% decrease in their total sow mortality across their entire system, right? And now we're duplicating on other farms. And every farm we've ever done this on, we've seen that kind of drop on. So, end of the day, if you have that type of feeding system, stall-based or even pen-based system, where you're dropping the feed once a day, and you can be there to identify those sows that aren't eating, flag them, and then come back and treat them according to the protocol for those that need to be treated. I'm fairly confident you're going to see a response to that. And I think it just gets back to the fact that we're catching them early, particularly with those lame sows. I think what happens is we don't catch them until they're extremely lame. And if by that time, any amount of anti-inflammatories, or if there's a disease product that we can treat with an antibiotic, that damage has been done. And no matter what we do with them, it's not going to turn them around, right? We're not going to see any response.
Salmonella presents significant challenges to pig health and performance, and poses food safety risks to humans. As the first and only vaccine offering live attenuated strains of both Salmonella 𝗁𝗃𝗁𝗃 and 𝗽𝗹𝗁, Enterosol Salmonella TC from 𝗺𝗷𝗁 protects pigs against both serotypes with a single oral dose. Talk to your 𝗺𝗷𝗁 representative to learn more.
Yep. Repeatable, making an impact. That's awesome to hear. The labor constraints are real, right? So if somebody's listening to this and they're saying, I like it, getting across the whole barn seems like maybe not doable. Is there an area of that gestation barn you can focus on and get the most bang for your buck?
Yeah, that was tricky, right? That is one of the things that we looked at. We knew we had about 30 minutes. So we really focused on the farm staff. It was like, okay, you're going to drop, and then you got to walk really quick. And all you're looking for is those that don't get up and flag them, right? So get them, flag a card, drop a card, because you're right. Really, we saw treatments all across the board. I'd say within 30 days of farrowing, maybe we saw a few more. In probably the first 30 days after weaning, we could maybe see a few more. Sure. So if you don't have the ability to look at them all, but I would say we would have seen, that we would have seen the distribution. We could have seen them at any time within that. The biggest key is just focus on those that aren't eating. They're not getting up. There's a reason why they're not getting up. That's the most important thing. If you have that type of feeding system where you can flag them.
Yeah. Cats going off feed, not very interesting from a medical standpoint, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But a pig that doesn't want to eat, that is like blinking red lights that there's a problem there. It's tremendous information, Chris, very applicable towards a big industry problem, and I really appreciate you coming on and sharing that with the audience.
Yep, my pleasure. Good to talk to you.